Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today we are discussing change. So let me go ahead and start a PowerPoint. The structure is very simple. I'm going to make a short presentation. This is based on Mortimer Adler's Great Ideas. This is part of the Great Books program. What the Great Books program does is that it brings together all thinkers from philosophers, psychologists, historians, economists, novelists, scientists, everybody. And they ask, what do these people talk about? So these are ideas on change from pretty much all thinkers. So I'm going to do a whirlwind tour of that. And then we are going to directly go into breakout rooms with 3 questions in mind. All right. So keep track of things that interest you. Okay. Use pen and paper, or you can use your phone to keep track of all the things that interest you. And then you get to discuss them in breakout rooms with a small number of people, 6 to 8 people. And then we come back and we will go through the questions again. You can talk about your takeaways, or you can put more questions on the table. All right. And then we will do kind of rapid fire questions, all kinds of things afterwards. Okay. All right, so let's get started. So change. So this is the table of contents. I'm going to talk about change in physics, then change in biology, change in psychology, change in society, change in philosophy, and then the questions. Let's start with physics. Okay, in order to figure out what is actually changing, you can understand it that it is changing. But if you want to really figure out change, you have to start measuring it. So for example, everybody, human beings have noted for a long time that the heavens move, the stars move. But it was Tycho Brahe who started systematically measuring all the movements in the sky. And that was the beginning of saying, okay, how are they moving? People like Kepler use that data to figure that out. Now, change is change over time. And measurement of time is critical. So for example, before Galileo, ability to measure time was not very good. You could measure it at kind of a gross level. You could say a day. A day is a natural time that you can measure. But anything smaller than that was very hard to measure. You would use things like sundials, but again, the accuracy was not that good. So Galileo was genius in measuring time. It's the pendulum thing. My favorite examples of his measurement was measurement of change, because he was trying to figure out how things fall. And the problem with that is that things fall very fast. And how are you going to measure things? How are you going to measure the pattern of something that moves that fast when you don't have anything to measure it by? So you know what he did? I have actually gone to Florence to see this. There is the apparatus that he used. He used an inclined plane, and he had bumps on the plane. So when the ball rolled down, it produced a sound. And what he did was that he noticed that our ability of hearing rhythm is fantastic. If you miss even slightly, you can tell. So he adjusted those bumps on the inclined plane so that they produced a regular rhythm. And he was able to figure out the pattern of movement of an inclined plane. And then inclined plane converts, the same applies to a falling ball. So that was just an ingenious way of measuring motion. For a long time, we did not really know how to measure motion. And it was Newton and Leibniz who really took it to the next level with calculus, the differential calculus, and the idea of infinitesimal limits, the idea of limits and infinitesimal quantities are things. We've done a full lecture on calculus for everybody, along with Stacy, who's a mathematician. I I would recommend that on our 52 Living Ideas YouTube channel. It's a very profound idea of calculus, and our ability to handle change dramatically went up as a result of calculus. So calculus is a huge invention, critical invention of handling change. There is always, scientists are trying to figure out the causes of change. That's what you're saying. It's not just that change exists, but you're trying to figure out why change happens. So that is another pattern that is there. Now you can keep track of as many thoughts that you find interesting here, and then we can discuss all of them as we go on. Briefly, I want to touch upon chemistry. Um, People figure out, we're trying to figure out, what turns into what. And alchemists spent enormous amount of energy trying to say, combine various things and see what the results of that are. And people like Lavoisier came up with the idea, discovered the idea of elements, the things that remain unchanged, and it's the combination of those things that keep changing. So the idea of being able to arrive at a concept of element was a huge step in chemistry, which again happened through kind of quantitative measurement of things. So there is, the theme of kind of measurement, trying to get at root causes of change, which dominates physics. In biology, for the longest time, everybody held that the species were fixed. Most people did not travel much. They were aware of species only in their locality. And those never changed as far as they could see. So they thought that species were static. Darwin, who's one of my favorite scientists, before he went on this voyage to South America, he read this little book by Lyell on geology, who had just come up with a very interesting way of explaining geological facts. What Lyell showed is that everyday factors that you see all the time, like wind, water flowing, sun, given enough time, produce massive change. That was the core idea of Lyell. And Darwin took that idea with him when he went to South America. The thing that he saw in South America was this massive variety of species, very different from the species that he had seen in England. For example, he was interested in beetles. So when he landed, and he was actually very good at collecting all this kind of sub varieties of beetles that are there in England. When he landed in South America, he describes this experience. He just looked down and he just saw like 12 different kinds of beetles that he had never seen before. And he was trying to get hold of all of them. And he stuck one, his hands were full, so he stuck one in his mouth and it secreted some kind of a chemical in response, and he had to spit it out. But it is kind of going out there, getting data, enabled him to see the variety, firstly, the variety of life. And the making the connection from that of saying, okay, he asked the question, why is it that the birds vary from island to island, but they're similar but different? And what is the cause of all of it? And he came up with his theory of evolution by natural selection, which is basically three principles. Inheritance, it means you pass on the genes. Second principle is the variation, that while the transmission is taking place, there is variation, and then there is natural selection, that some of these changes are successful at propagating themselves. So that's a quick look at kind of change in biology. Before Darwin, there was no conception of change in biology. And after Darwin, we saw that species were variable, that changed dramatically over time. Let's go to psychology. I'm going to just quickly talk about various things here. This is a huge issue. How do you change? How do people change? Do people change? And if you change, how do you change? What is the role of unconscious? What is the role of conscious in change? What's the role of will? What is habit? And how do habits change? What are the different techniques of making fundamental change in your life? Cognitive behavioral therapy is one, but there are many others. So there is all these questions that are open that we discuss all the time in these meetups. Then there is, let's see here. Then there is change in society. How does social change happen? When you look at our life at the evolutionary level, and then the cities, then different technologies changed. There's all kinds of change that has happened in society. When you look at a traditional society, it seems almost static, but that too is changing. What kind of societies change more than others? There are many people who have thoughts about it. Hegel talks about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Marx talks about historical materialism as being, he thinks that materials is the cause of change. Schumpeter talks about the creative destruction and business cycles, cycles of creation and destruction that goes through. So there's lots of thoughts about, lots of questions on how does social change take place. Then we come to philosophy last. And in philosophy, essentially, there are two views on change, two extreme views. It is Parmenides versus Heraclitus. Parmenides holds that there is no change, that change is complete illusion. His descendant is Plato, who holds that forms are unchanging, and and everything else is kind of demeaned almost. Heraclitus points out that you can't step in the same river twice, that there is only change. Aristotle is kind of half Plato, half Heraclitus. Aristotle had a tremendous background in biology with his family, and he is very, very good when he talks about living things. Darwin regarded him as the greatest biologist. So he has, especially when he talks about living things, like on his book On the Soul, he's brilliant. But when he talks about other things like his physics, he goes back to the Platonic model. The core issue is the relationship between being and becoming. We are changing all the time. At the same time, we are something. So what is the relationship between being and becoming? That is the core philosophical question that all of these people talk about, and they have different views on those. The fact of change, almost nobody denies except Parmenides. But then it's all about questions like, what are the underlying principles of change? What are the causes of change? What is the connection between being and becoming? So these are kind of various issues that people have put on the table. Now, what I'm saying is that all of these people, this galaxy of thinkers that Mortimer Adler talks about, the cutoff is at 1900. Okay, so this is before the Industrial Revolution really took off. So I would say that each one of you actually has faced more change than these folks. Because after Industrial Revolution, the pace of change has dramatically accelerated. So you should be able to do a lot better than all these folks in thinking about change. Okay, so I'm really curious to see this. So the entire aim here was to just put kind of some ideas on the table and then go into the breakout room. So let me just recap. So we talked about change in physics, then biology, then psychology, then social change and philosophy. So we talked about kind of measurement and figuring out the causes of change. Here in physics, we talked about the importance of looking at the whole picture and seeing how things change over time and doing kind of the inductive work that Darwin did. We've talked about change in psychology a lot throughout our meetups. There is nothing more I can say that will add to that. We've talked some about societal change, not much. We don't focus much on it, but this is a huge topic. This is basically, how does history work? And what are the patterns and what are the causations in that? So for example, the chains, the line of thinking along chains, they hold that it is the medium of communications or medium of thinking, like oral communication. There is an oral age where everybody's speaking. So that provides for a certain level of operation. When you move to written, it's called the scribal age, which moves to a different level. When you move to printing, where most people can read and write, it moves to a completely new level. Then you go electronic. With TV, the way in which things work are different. It's kind of, in some ways, it is going back to the oral culture, some of the characteristics of the oral culture. And then, of course, we are in the digital age where we are still trying to figure out what's going on, because we are still in midst of this. It's very clear that it's not only speeding up, the world is not only speeding up, but it's accelerating. More than that, there is increase of acceleration, which is the term in physics is called the jerk. So it's going up like that. So that's what we are faced with. Okay, this is what philosophers said about Parmenides. This is Parmenides and Heraclitus' extreme views, and then you've got Plato and Aristotle, who kind of are, Plato follows Parmenides mostly. Aristotle is kind of combination of Plato and Heraclitus a little bit. The issue is being and becoming, and it's all about trying to figure out the unchanging principles of change. Okay, so with that, I want to put forth these 3 questions for you for the breakout room. So I want, in the breakout room, what we're going to do is that we're going to let each person talk for 1 to 2 minutes on their take on all of these 3 questions, very briefly, and then we will open it up, and have a kind of open-ended discussion. Try to keep notes. You will not be able to go through all these questions thoroughly in the breakout rooms, but keep notes. And then always talk what is the best thing that you have on the paper there. That way we can have as deep a conversation as we can. So the first question is, what do you feel and think about change as a whole? The second, what remains the same through change? So whenever you're trying to understand change, because that is the heart of science, of saying, what are the unchanging principles of change? Like Newton's laws, right? These are Newton's laws of motion. Yes, things change, but he's trying to figure out, how do they change? And the last question is the most important one. How do you thrive in an accelerating world, the world that we are living in? Okay, so those are the questions. So I'm going to start the breakout rooms in a second here. Give me a second. Welcome back. Welcome back. All right. So it's time for takeaways. I would like to know what you guys got from it. So we'll go one by one. So first question is, what do you think of change? What's your take on change? So you can go ahead, and this is highly interactive. So if you would like to share what you think about change in general, we can, and then we will ask the second question, and that is, what remains change? How do you figure out what remains the same through change? And then finally, we're going to be talking about how do you thrive in an accelerating world. So who would like to go first? What are your thoughts about change in general? You can go ahead and type exclamation mark in Zoom in order to speak, as always. That's the first rule. Second rule, keep on topic. Third, be brief. And number 4, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything, but be courteous and be courteous. So it's going to be Joe, Linda, Jean, and Judith. Joe.
So there are a lot of different thoughts on how to approach this and change in general. The obviously the physics, the biology, the psychology, and how changes in societies occur. But one of the things that had come up in our breakout room, and it's something that I often think of, is there something that can't change? And how that impacts decision making specifically. So even I look at frameworks, when you're applying them to problems, you look at, what can I change, what can I change, and what maybe I can do better, because then that is also how you can really measure meaningful decisions. And that's just one particular takeaway. That's a systems takeaway. One system, there's a systems approach, and then there's a decision-making approach. So then there are how systems change and economic systems change. And that's what we're currently, and we'll get into this later, I'm assuming, with the idea of the digital economy and how that.
Yeah.
But the other point, and I don't mean to take Becky's line, is that the idea of how if we embrace change and, versus resisting change and the implications of that, and extreme change and how that is completely disorienting. And somehow the dichotomy of control also came up in my thoughts, not in our conversation, but that's a side thing. And then also the importance of measurement and preciseness of measurement in all of these areas of change. So I have a lot of other things too, but I'll leave it there for now.
Sure. We'll have plenty of time to kind of cycle back and do kind of multiple takes on it. So wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Linda, Jean, and Judith. Folks, you can just type an exclamation mark to share your takeaways. Linda.
You ask how we feel about change.
Yes.
I think the only constant in life is change. We either adapt to survive, or we don't adapt and the change can harm us. But there's no knowing in advance whether the change is going to be good or bad. And it's our duty to learn what we need to survive with the change. We have no choice if we want to survive.
Excellent. Wonderfully put. Thank you, Linda. Next up is Jean, Judith, and Kevin. Jean.
Yeah, I shared with my group. Actually, my first name is change. So it's Gung, this means change and reform. My friend sometimes said, maybe you should change your name so you don't change so much. So
Jean, what's your name? How do you, what's your name in Chinese?
Gung, that means change, reform. So I think I was wondering, if that, I love to change, it's the reason I come to US because working for a design company in China, in Beijing, and I can see my life will be like in 10 years, 20 years, and it just bored me. So I decided to come to US, go to a new land. Then after I live here for a few years and have kids, and I see, what my life could be in next 10 years or 20 years, there's nothing exciting. So I moved back to China. So I wonder, is that because when I grew up, I was moving between my mom and my grandpa. So I was changing between the cities. So it's 11 hours by train. So I wonder that's the reason, I was adapt to it. And so now I want to move to Europe, so I just cannot, if things are too predictable, it's less exciting to me. So I want life more exciting. And I want to live in different part of the world, understand life is too short not to change. So I think also voluntarily change is good. And also I learned from Think and Grow Rich. The only thing you have control is your mindset. So if you have no control about the outside world, if you have control of your mindset, how you see things, then you can feel comfortable with anything change.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jean. Next up is Judith, Kevin, Jyoti, Brian, and Jade. Judith.
Okay, so, well, I think change is wonderful. I mean, who would want to be in a world where we can't evolve and be creative and do things? So, change is good. But what I was talking quite a bit about was our responsibility now, especially because of the things that you outlined, physics, that's the change in physics. I mean, the laws of physics change as we understand them, but do they change? I don't know. Biology changes usually very slowly. Psychology, I don't really know. I mean, over human history, we talk about, some elements change and some don't. I mean, part of it's tied to our biology after all. And then the changes in society and philosophy, they're all really important as we navigate the fastest change, which is in technology. I think that's the fastest change. And that's what, like we were talking in the other meetup, that's what stimulates all those other changes after, like our society changes after we make technological changes, our philosophies change after we invent new things. So that means we have a lot of responsibility, and it's not easy because we don't know what we're doing, and whatever we do invent, we never guess all the ways that it can be used. We invent things for good purposes, and that's not always the way it ends up. Mm-hmm. So I think all of, well, how do we protect against that? I don't know. I mean, I think it is something we have to consciously think about when we make changes, but I think it requires experts in all of those areas to offer insights, and it's a lot of personal responsibility, I think, as we live and we recognize, that we can change things really fast, but the living organisms on the earth can't, and that we are, after all, biological beings, and we're tied to this earth, so maybe that should be important to us. So that's what I think about thriving in an accelerating world, and I think maybe I've answered all your questions.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Judith. And I want to tell you that on Sundays, that entire series is going to be exactly about this, about kind of technological change. What does it mean? What's our responsibility? How do we handle it? So that's what it's going, it's about. And we're building it very systematically. We're looking into what human beings are, what's the best way of understanding all our faculties, everything that we are capable of, and what do these changes do to us, and how, just making sense of it all. So that's what it is about. Next up is going to be Kevin, Jyoti, Brian, Jade, and Andrew. Kevin, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Frank. The art of life is a constant adjustment to our surroundings. The change is constant, not linear. And the accelerated change could put ourselves, cannot adjust it anymore. Especially in this digital age, or the technology changing themselves, they can, it's more than we can understand. Mm-hmm. For example, we have bionic neuron could be developed, interface between a machine and a human being. Could come true. However, our biological sociological and philosophical perspective, seems not much change, or even change. It's isolated change. Possible one solution, we need to work together, individual or group or collective collaboration could do it better, find one right way to adapt a new change. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you very much. Next up is Jyoti, Brian, Jade, and Andrew. Jyoti, go ahead.
Yeah, changes happen in life, all the time. Sometimes they are due to the external forces and sometimes due to the internal. You may or may not have any control. I think how you react to those changes and adapt to them is in your control. So having said that, I think changes always give you an opportunity to regrow or rebirth or what have you. You start becoming more prepared for the future because you know this is happening, and you just develop some kind of an attitude, positive attitude. And sometimes the changes are not for the best, but you start looking for something in it that might work out for you. You start you become positive. And sometimes you can lose your dear ones. And then you say that now I'm back to, square one, where I started from. And then you start looking at it, okay, now I'm at this stage of my life. Maybe there is something left for me to build upon. So you always keep on going and figuring out how to survive, how to move on, and how to get the best out of yourself rather than going down with it. Letting go of the past and moving one step forward is the opportunity that change gives you. And society builds up because of that. And we have to go according to the changes, like in this pandemic. There are people who are sitting, having mental depression, all that stuff. And the other people are saying, maybe I can be a little bit more creative and do something to build myself up. So it depends on the individual and the perceptions and what have you. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jyoti. Next up is Brian, Jade, and Andrew. Brian.
Okay. Am I working? Because I don't seem to see a change, but can you hear me?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, fine. Okay, change. Well, I mean, all I can really say about it is that I welcome it. I think the reason is because my life has been changed all the way through. I remember from when I first stopped being reliant on my parents, we'd lived in 12 houses up to that stage, 12 different houses. When I was working, I remember at least 15 different countries I've worked in. I've worked on design teams for unguided missiles, mainframe computer system networks. Everything seems to change. Maximum of 2 years is what I've had. And probably the only time of my life that's been stable has been since I retired, when nothing much seems to change, which is good. But it's been a way of life for me, so I welcome it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Next up is Jade, followed by Andrew. Jade.
Change is an interesting topic.
Jade, your sound is very faint.
I don't know. People have been
now. This is better. Can you use the headphones that you used yesterday? I'm going to go to Andrew and then I'll come back to you. Okay, Andrew.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, a couple of things that I thought of after we got together, just as I had time to listen and I was hearing people on a few things. One, when we talk about change, we need to differentiate between adventure, or I'll call self-directed change. That's one thing, and there are all kinds of things you can say about that, as opposed to necessary change as a result of catastrophic events, for example. So those are almost like two different discussions. Another thing that I thought of is that our perception of change depends on our level of physical comfort. So right now, we can talk a lot about these positive perceptions of change. You know, we welcome change. Change is an opportunity for growth. It's all about your attitude about change. Well, we should be grateful that we have an opportunity to have that philosophy or opinion about it, because you can have those thoughts about it when you're in a state of relative comfort and infrequent change to some extent. I mean, you're safe. Then you can start philosophizing about the benefits of change. So those are my thoughts. Embracing change is a luxury. Let's be grateful for it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. Jade, you're next.
So I think there are a lot of reasons why change happens. I think sometimes necessity, like there's an age-old saying, necessity is the mother of change. So need, resources, abundance, scarcity, those cause change. We react to our environment. Variables, I have cats. So if I introduce a new cat, all of a sudden the way they function due to the proximity, that changes also. Like I bring in a cat that jumps on the table. My other cats see that as a revolutionary act. They're all starting to jump on the table. Like, this is a great idea. The cats are revolutionary, but they didn't intend to be a revolutionary. They're just untrained, and yeah. But then I might decide everyone jumps on the table, just like everyone, like other governments and rulers do, because this is my home. I run things. The cats don't run things. So it's kind of like I think there's often a domino effect. One thing impacts another, which impacts another. Boredom and curiosity, those are other really big game changers. Sometimes, like, you know, people just do things, even scientists, not because we necessarily need it, just because they're curious and they feel they don't have anything better to do, seeking novelty. Discontent and discomfort, that's a reason to change. You're uncomfortable, so you try to get to a more comfortable circumstance, which often comes from necessity or something else being shifted. There's also the concept of control, but I'll say the desire to belong and social pressure that often leads to change. Again, a domino effect, which may come in any form. It might be coercion, it might be manipulation, it might be basic influence. Like, think about it, we got influencers now. So they're people who their whole point is to change the way we do things, see things, and the things we want. Then it's like the desire of control. For instance, like, kids don't go outside and play anymore by themselves often. And someone who does let their kid go outside and play by themselves, they're kind of looked at like, what are you doing? Because the whole idea behind that is a sense of control. I want to control who interacts with my kid and how they interact with my kid. And it's all because the primary objective is to keep that child safe. So if there are bad people outside, I change what I do and I keep my child inside. Now, with that control, you let go of some control because you change your own personal behavior. But at the same time, you still have changed the possible impacts that those quote unquote bad actors can have. Well, no, if they're gonna harm your child, bad actors can have on your child. So sometimes you change what you do so that you can maintain a semblance of control within an external environment that's controlling, changing.
Wonderful.
That's my 2 cents.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Jade. Next up is going to be Becky. Becky.
So during our breakout room, we talked about whether or not change was good or bad. And it's really neither. We change because we're in a system or a society and everything around us is changing. So in order for us to continue being part of that, we have to change as well. And so our system really puts a cap onto how much we can change and so if everyone else is changing along and we stay behind, we're either propelled forward through external forces and we're forced to change against our will, or or we get left behind. So that's a harder way of changing, and that's an extremely reactionary way of changing. But if we choose to move ahead with everything else that's happening around us, then that's in our control, and we aren't we're able to change on our own terms. When we're forced to change against our own will, it may be so extreme to the point that it's utter chaos. We lose ourselves. We have nothing to stay grounded, nothing to tether us, and it can be quite destructive. But when we choose to, and we have that control, it can be extremely constructive. But going back to the idea of living in that system, a choice to change is still restricted, because something can be so visionary that if technology doesn't support it, or the ecosystem it doesn't support it, that will fail, and it can reemerge in a few years, and everything else has changed along with it, where it can be supported. So that happens all the time too. So yeah, those are my 2 cents.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is going to be Laura and Madeline. And Joe, I'll come to you in the next round. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
We're going to do multiple rounds.
That's fine.
So
No
you'll be
problem.
the first one in the next round.
Well, okay.
Laura and Madeline. Laura.
Just seems to me that there's kind of a Darwinian approach to change a lot. You know, it's survival of the fittest in some way or another. And so I just take that note from listening to everything. I personally think, you know, change is good if it's beneficial. If you should seek it. It's good when you have control over it. I mean, lots of times we don't have control. I certainly know that for sure. I think you have to be willing to adapt. I think if you don't, you don't cease to exist if you can't adapt. I mean, again, Darwinian. And I can't get around it, no matter however you put it. And I guess I leave it at that.
Wonderful. Excellent, Laura. Thanks. Next up is going to be Madeline, followed by JS. Madeline.
Yes. I had been thinking and talking in the breakout room about Darwin. Yes, he was a towering giant. There is no doubt about it. He was a towering giant whose thinking took place in the context of his time, in which it was a big European project going on for the preceding couple of centuries, the invention of chronology and history. When you think of Darwin, you should think of porcelain and Wedgwood. He was a member of the Wedgwood family, which made the porcelain. Porcelain had recently been imported from China. It didn't exist in Europe. And so all of the ideas about the earth moving, like Lyell and all of those people, that idea was a basic Taoist and animist concept that underlied Chinese philosophy, and that the earth was in motion, even the rocks were in motion, even though it was so slow that we cannot perceive it. It's beyond our physiological threshold. So in the context, and Darwin was a member of the Wedgwood family. So in the context of British exploration, empire, putting history together, Darwin came up with his ideas. There was another man, Alfred Russel Wallace. He came up with the ideas independently at the same time. In other words, he was embedded in the same cultural context as Darwin. Darwin published first, basically.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is going to be JS, and then we'll go to the next question. JS.
Hi.
Hi, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking that pretty much before humans, every species was very much trying to survive, acting with nature. And when humans came along, we have the possibility to understand why there are many Irish tenors and why there are many Black bases from Africa, because it had to do with the climate. We can understand the patterns and the cause and the effect, so we can understand it in ourselves also. So we have the freedom to take a look at adaptive patterns that don't really serve us, and we can change them. And I just wanted to say one last thing about the speeding up of change. As we discover more and more truths about how the world works and what doesn't work and what does work, and aim towards survival, there's a whole new realm of consciousness. That once you entertain a possibility, suddenly the laws and the physical laws can suddenly be changed. So that enters a whole new realm as we realize our own power more and more in our minds.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, JS. Next up is Jennifer. Jennifer, go ahead.
Hi. So what do I feel about change? I feel anxiety and anticipation in tandem, equally, or vacillating depending on the cause. I feel that change is necessary individually, communally, and globally. It can be perceived as deserved and undeserved at times as well. It exposes multitudes of discoveries and perspectives. It can be understood or not understood until years later. Change exposes strengths and vulnerabilities. It exposes what you need to do at the moment and beyond. We need it to learn and to grow. That's all.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Okay, wonderful. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the next question. But before that, I wanted to do a quick summary of what was said, and then we'll go. See, I'm also trying to write. So let me see what happened here. Just a second. I have to refresh my screen. Hold on. I'm using too many computers.
To writing. What happened to paper and pen?
All right. Let's go ahead. All right, this should do it. Okay. All right. So Joe said that, is there something that we can't change? And he talked about embracing versus accepting change. He also talked about the importance of measurement. Okay. Laura, could you mute yourself, please? It sounds... Linda had a very simple take, that change just happens, and you have a choice of whether you're going to adapt or basically lose. Jean talked about the exciting nature of change, of wanting change in life. Judith talked about the fact she looked at all kinds of changes, and she said fastest change is in technology. And given that there is a change taking place in technology, there is all kinds of responsibility that comes with it. Kevin talked about the fact that technology is changing faster than you understand. Laura talked about the change as being Darwinian, and that it is good when you have control over it, and you must be willing to face it. Madeline gave us the cultural context of Darwin. Jyoti talked about the opportunities offered by change and whether you actually take those opportunities or you don't. Brian said, I welcome it. And his life has been full of change. And it has been kind of normal for him. Andrew talked about this, and I think Becky also pointed this out, is difference between proactive versus reactive. That when you are actually going towards the change and choosing the change, what Jordan Peterson says, choosing the chaos on your own terms versus reacting to change when it happens to you, the difference between that. And he was also talking about how you look at change depends on the level of comfort or security you have. Jade made a whole bunch of points about the imitative nature of change, how there is a domino effect as a result of that, how boredom and curiosity drive change. She talked about discomfort, the desire to belong, and the how that is used by influencers. And she talked about a sense of control. I don't think I'm doing justice to it. She always puts lot more points on the table. So these just few things. Becky talked about, is change good or bad? And it's neither. She also talked about its importance of confronting change on your own terms. And she also talked about the interesting point about, when does a change actually happen? When the context is right for it, there can be times when the context is not right. It's maybe too much of a change for it to take hold. JS talked about, once you accept your own power, change looks different to you. Jennifer was extremely, poetic and very brief, and covered a very large number of points, like that it is necessary, the difference between deserved and undeserved change. It exposes strengths and weaknesses. So it's just an amazing set of things that everybody said. Now, the next question is, what remains the same in change? Because change is, things are changing, but what remains change? How do you understand kind of principles that remain the same? Is there anything that remains the same through change? And if so, what it is, and what is the value of that? So that's the second question on the table. If anybody wants to speak about that, just go ahead and type exclamation mark.
Can you repeat the question, Shrikant?
Yeah, the question was the second question in the breakout room, that what remains the same through change. So this is the point about being and becoming. This is the point about saying, okay, even when things are changing, you are something. There can be systems that change. There are laws of change, which remains the same across change. So it's about kind of looking for things that remain the same within the change.
Thank you.
All right. Does anybody have anything to say? So it's going to be Judith, and then I'm going to go to Joe, because Joe had his hand raised before. You can talk about anything you want, Joe. So Judith, yes, the constancy, go ahead.
Oops, yeah. So, yeah, well, I think that's an important question. I don't know the answer. I think it depends on which type of change you're talking about, but I think that is important to kind of identify what elements are constant and what we can learn maybe as in our own lives personally, or as we produce things, or as we live in communities together, like to look in the past to see what elements were the same. So the historical context in any one of these things, I think, is helpful to help us to identify if we can figure out what are those constants. And then those are the things that will help guide us probably as we make our own personal choices, or, as communities make choices.
Excellent point, Judith. I think that's the primary use of history, because what happens is that when you try to figure out change by just looking at what is happening right now, you really don't have any basis, because you don't have the data. You don't have large enough patterns that form a background. So looking at history and seeing, okay, what kind of patterns happen, that gives you a crucial, crucial data to be able to figure out a pattern, which you cannot do with things that are happening just if you focus only on the things right now. Becky, what do you think?
Oh, let's have Joe go first.
Oh yeah, Joe. Sorry, Joe, and then Becky.
Oh, I was just gonna make a quick comment about, coming back to, even it kind of applies to the second question, is that the idea of death is something that doesn't change, but it also drives change. So that's an interesting kind of thing, is that this need for survival is something that doesn't change. So that this is driving all our interactions. You can, I guess you can take a transhumanist approach and say, okay, we're going to live forever, something like that. But in reality, that this idea of death actually being a constant is what drives all other change. That was the only point I wanted to make.
Wonderful. Excellent point, Joe. Next up is Becky, Janelle, and Jean. Becky.
So things that can be modeled by the Pareto distribution demonstrates the Lindy effect. And then, so I'll read what the Lindy effect is. The Lindy effect is a theory that the future life expectancy of some non-perishable thing, like a technology or an idea, is proportional to its current age, so that every additional period of survival implies a longer remaining life expectancy. Where the Lindy effect applies, mortality rate actually decreases with time. So things that have survived this long have survived for a reason, and the expected survival is proportional. Like, it longer it survives, the more likely it's going to continue surviving. Certain ideas like mythology, certain religions, these demonstrate the Lindy effect. So I would say that's relatively unchanged.
Excellent point. Thanks, Becky. Next up is Janelle, Jean, JS, and Jade.
For me, I shared it in the group. For me, what I think from a human standpoint, what remains the same through change is that there's really only three outcomes that could come from it. And that's either you're going to survive, thrive, or transform as an individual. And, if change is inevitable, if you choose, depending on what actions you choose, you're going to fall into one of those three categories. So it's just like Jordan Peterson, that concept of, are you going to willingly go and face the chaos? It's more of a central sense of locus, or sense of self-efficacy that you have to develop within yourself at some point in time in order to be able to determine what outcome or where you want to see yourself at the end of the day, so to speak. That's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you, Janelle. Next up is going to be Jean, JS, and Jade. Jean.
Yeah, I think what don't change is natural law. Actually, I forgot to mention the Chinese I Ching, Yi means change. It's one of the most powerful and still relevant today. So natural law itself doesn't change. Human nature doesn't change. Humanity doesn't change. What changes is the technology, the appearance, the external things change, and change very fast pace. So I think it's that's why we study Stoicism and 道德经, because at that time, those fundamental things don't change. They still apply today, no matter how long it was.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Next up is JS, followed by Jade. JS?
I would say that the truth doesn't change, and we just don't know all the truth yet. So we know some of it, like react, cooperation. Those are personal things that I don't think you'll find situations where they're not correct. So I think we're covering more, and we take successful models and you'll see the same principles operating in the most thriving of the period. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jess. Next up is Jade. Jade, go ahead.
I think change, what doesn't change, I think is interesting, because a lot of our conversation is about like the inevitability of it, but there are some people and communities who kind of know they don't have to. In New York, we are Borough Park, a large Jewish community that decides to do things the way they've always done them. Yes, there are some changes like cell phones and things like that kind of have been embraced. The Amish, they're another example, Mormons. There are lots of people who decide the world is changing and I don't want to, and I don't have to. I think with that, it's a question of why don't they feel like they have to keep up with the Joneses? What is it about them that makes it different? And people could argue about whether or not their way of life is okay or not. That's fair game. But I think it's, if we focus less on the subjects of the point and more on the premise of the fact of these people recognize that they don't necessarily have to change and kind of why. And I think a lot of the time, well, not a lot of the time, I think sometimes it's a lack of attention. And again, attention span and boredom. That is something that might be through the ages because as Joe was saying, the desire for survival, but we're living with a lot of people who don't fear survival. Like they've made themselves so comfortable to a certain extent where it was taken for granted. Now things have put that all out of whack for them. So people who are usually like, oh, I'm fine, I don't have to worry about anything. My life, no, there's some things, money and comfort and all those other things that they can't protect you from to a certain extent. And so to me, a lot of thoughts and a lot of ways of life, they're fads. They feed them to us until we need to consume something else. Because if we had a consistent way of life, if we wanted the same curtains for our lifetime, it wouldn't work. So like, I think on some level, we're now pushed to think differently all the time, even if it's just a rebranding of the same thought, which it often is. We're pushed. They're constantly motivational speakers rebranding the same old stuff. I think it's so. I think we sometimes think things have changed, but they haven't. It's just a new spin on the same concept. And I guess the thing is, what is the little black dress of thoughts? Little black dress is supposed to be timeless, classic. Do we have a little black dress of thoughts? Is there something that someone can come to the table with that people would not look at you like you're dated, you're this, you're that for thinking about this thing in a particular way? But even when I look at a lot of the stuff that's going on, if you go back, and YouTube is great for this, you could see people who are saying the exact same thing in the exact same way, not even a rebranded way of saying it. It's already done. So I don't know. I think some of change, I think, is change, and some of it is just our perception. Like we think we're doing something new, but we're just reinventing the wheel. We're painting it pink.
Wonderfully put. Thanks, Jade. This is a topic of great interest to me. I mean, the way I think about it is like a system of change. I mean, for example, Sullivan thinks of it as form follows function. So it's like you're trying to follow, you're trying to focus on a function, and the form it generates keeps changing. So, or like, for example, Magda Arnold has a concept of self-ideal. You have a self-ideal, but it's an active ideal. It changes, but it changes actually slowly. You do many, many things in order to make that happen. Or Boyd's idea of improving your capacity for independent action. So that is that is the principle that you're trying to do. But in order to do that, you're actually doing a lot of other things, a lot of changes. So it's like, it's the principle that remains the same, the focus that remains the same in midst of everything that is doing, that kind of holds everything together, and something like that. So that's how I think about it. All right, so let's go to the final question, which is in some ways the toughest question and the most challenging question. But I think we have warmed up enough for it. So the question is, how do you thrive in a fast changing world? How do you thrive in an accelerating world? How do you thrive in a world whose acceleration is also going up? It's really going fast, and it keeps going faster and faster. And how do you how do you, you can talk about coping with it. You can talk about thriving in it. What do you do? How do you do it? So let's start with Madeline. So folks, if you would like to answer the question, talk about your thoughts about that, which is really like a culmination of this meetup. Please go ahead and do that. Just type by exclamation mark. Next up is going to be Madeline. Madeline.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on thriving during change that relate to both what Brian said and also what Jade was saying. That has to do with stabilizing your external life. And also, so there's that aspect of it, which is kind of what Brian was talking about. I found that as I got older and my external life stabilized, I had greatly accelerated internal rate of change, and I matured so much compared to when I was younger and moving around and trying different things. I like the Amish and the Mennonites, what they do. The reason they do what they do is not because they're unwilling to change. It's because their values are that these things are not important. The newest kind of zipper or the newest kind of dress or the newest kind of car are really unimportant compared to their spiritual values. And for me, the way that I got through a lot of change and continue to change is through having an active spiritual life. So I'd say, usually we think of the body as being like the hardware, the mind and emotions as being like the software, but there's a third thing. And that third thing, let's just call it electricity or the soul. And without that as a component in your life, you're not going to survive change very well, and you're not going to adapt very well. So my takeaway or my advice basically is pick something and try it. Pick a type of meditation or pick a type of prayer. Just try integrating it into your life somehow every day and see what happens.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Janelle, Jean, Jyoti, and Joseph. It's all J's. Okay, Janelle.
What I offered in the group and still on the concept of surviving, thriving, and transforming, it sort of echoes back to what we discussed in Outwitting the Devil and having a sense of definite purpose and trying to determine what that is for you and developing a set of principles or frameworks, sort of like what Madeline was saying, trying to develop a framework or a set of principles for which you can then funnel all of the information for what you're currently experiencing in the world, how you can then thrive in the world based off of how that information has been funneled through your internal systems. And then if you so chose that you wanted to transform yourself and self-actualize a newer outcome for yourself, then trying to figure out how you can actually do that based off of what it is that you already know and what you can anticipate in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Jean, Jyoti, and Joseph. Jean.
Yeah, I think I agree with someone mentioned earlier. Because our energy is limited, so we can't change everything about ourselves. And we have to focus the thing we really care about. So that may be the reason, the Jewish spiritual group, they focus so much on their spiritual part. They don't care about the other. They don't have energy to deal with other changes. Like Steve Jobs, he never changes his clothes, have the same clothes. So he doesn't need to think about which clothes to wear. So waste his energy. So that's kind of extreme way of saving energy for the change he made in the world, which is phenomenal. So I think find out what's most important and focus that to make the biggest change is more meaningful than make any tiny change around everything about your life.
Wonderful, wonderful point. Thank you, Jean. Next up is Jyoti, Joe, and Andrew. Jyoti.
Yeah, I think one becomes, if one, I think I will steal one point from Madeline about the spirituality. I think if you have peace and meditation in your life, you can survive the change. And if you become creative and become a little bit active in networking and socialization, that will help you. And community support. I'm beginning to realize how important is community support that can help you to keep going when the changes are taking place so rapidly around you. And just keeping yourself informed and learning new things, they all help. They are all survival tips, tricks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jyoti. Next up is Joe, Andrew, and Jade. Joe.
I'm just going to be very, very brief because essentially Janelle said exactly what I was going to say. It was the idea of having a set of principles and how you're managing your change, and you have to have a framework for essentially making decisions. And I think that once you have that, then you're able to, you know, make meaningful decisions that essentially lead to actions that allow you to survive. So, and thrive to a certain degree. So I think it's just essentially your principles diagram that you showed, you know, a few weeks ago, or maybe it might be a couple of months ago at this point. Having a set of principles that allow you essentially to survive and continually understanding how to embrace chaos and the unknown is also critical in that process. But again, if you have a set of principles, you can do that. So it's really not a problem.
Wonderful. Excellent. I just want to point out one interesting pattern that comes out of it is the power of subtraction, of getting rid of things. Because like most people think that all growth is addition, but a lot of the growth is subtraction, of kind of getting rid of stuff, which is not actually helping you, because that frees up the energy to focus on things that really, really matter to you. And it just increases your capacity to do things because you're not frittering away all your energy on other things. Next up is Andrew, Jade, Kevin, Laura, and Laura. Andrew.
Yeah, I'm actually going to pass. Thank you.
Okay. Next up is Jade.
I think I want to kind of cycle back to I think if I'm remembering right, his name was Andrew, and he was bringing in the concept of your internal state of being, kind of how that or it wasn't, might not have been directly about that, but there was some stuff saying like if you're not in a good place, it's going to be very hard to contend with change. And so I also kind of want to point out that like sometimes we're not okay for reasonable reasons. So we could lose a loved one, not someone just that we love, but someone who played a primary role in our life. And that's a huge change on, especially if that's someone who was integral in your mental processing and your physical ways of dealing with the world. So you have an internal and an external thing that has been shifted. So I think it's a question of being able to look at yourself and look at your surroundings and decide which do you prioritize, which needs the most attention, because sometimes you can't tend to both. So sometimes your internal world is a mess because you're trying to keep up an external look of like things are good. Sometimes your external world is a mess because you're focusing on the internal. Is there a way to balance the two and get to both of them back where they need to be? Just like that? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. I think everyone just has to be kind of cognizant and try and figure out how to navigate that. But yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jade. Next up is going to be Kevin, Laura, and Becky. Kevin.
Yes, thank you, Frank. The life is about a journey of experience and not a destination. So as an individual, keep your spiritual value, love, and passion. Build ideal yourself and future self. Maybe we cannot change the world, but you can change yourself or readjust yourself. As a human being, we need to work together to learn different perspective and collectively learn each other, and community support ourselves and as well support others. That's my take. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Laura, followed by Becky. Laura.
Okay. I think that commitment is really important. That, you know, you can think about all these things and decide this and that, but I think to make a commitment to yourself, to take it on, to follow through. It's easy to say, oh yeah, I think I'll do this and I think I'll do that, or I need this, and kind of it, unless you make a real commitment to doing it, it's useless. It's all talk and no action in effect.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. Next up is Becky and Fika. Becky?
I think that in accelerating technological worlds, it creates a incentives for everyone to specialize. And so collaboration would be necessary in order to really thrive, because of all these silos that arise from these deep specializations. I mean, it'd be nice if we introduce more generalists in, but tech has just become so advanced. It's hard to gather that kind of knowledge and experience beyond maybe 2 or 3 silos. So I think that collaboration is necessary. And I guess we also see it in globalization.
Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is Fika, followed by Brian. Fika, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. One of the things that I also mentioned in our breakout room was that change comes in different levels and to different people in different forms, right? So I couldn't help but I'm just going to say this before I forget. When we were talking about the patterns in change, and when change happens, what stays the same, one of the things that was coming to my mind was religion. When you look at humans' history, there's always, we have always changed, we have always evolved, and we need to be thankful to change for our evolution. But if you look at it, there's always been new religions, and they all follow the same pattern. The main principle of these religions are always the same, but the branches are different. There are new leaves and new flowers and new attraction to every religion, but the basic is the same. So the other thing was, I think it was Heraclitus that said no one can step in the same river twice, if I'm not mistaken. So yes, things change. We go through change all the time in our personal life, in our society, in our family, in different levels. But it's important, the changes that we can be responsible to make and how we handle those changes. Some things are out of our hands. Some of us have the luxury of embracing the change. Some of us don't, depending on what condition of life we're dealing with. There are people that live in war. There are people that live in extreme poverty. They don't have a lot of room to embrace changes that come to their lives. So I think one of the biggest things, and I know this might sound a little bit mushy, but mushy is just part of life. One of the biggest things that we can change in ourselves is to actually open our eyes to see the reality of every other human beings in the world. I have seen people living in countries that with many poor, with many people who live in horrible conditions, and they do not see that. It's the power of ignorance that humans carry. I've seen people that leave that life, leave the horrible life that they have. They go to a better life, they travel, they migrate, they become a person that now has a better life, and they forget about the past. So it's good for us to take these changes to make it something that is actually productive for us as individual human beings, for our families, for our societies, right? The biggest thing that we can do is to learn from change, to grow with the change. The growth can't be only through innovations. It should also be spiritual. It should also be mental growth. So if we put all of these together, then we can say, yes, I have taken a step forward, and I have made use of the changes that that occurred in my life. And again, I always like to emphasize this, that if we have the luxury of embracing change, we should always be mindful of people that do not have that luxury. Sometimes, you know, that quote of the Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. If you do have the power of embracing your changes, you're also responsible for the ones who don't. So just my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Fika. Next up is Brian. Brian, go ahead.
Okay, when I left university, which was quite a few years ago, I was told I was moving into a world which is undergoing tremendous acceleration, an accelerating world. And I was repeatedly told that every 10 years. I never really saw it. The conclusion I came to is, if you can manage your own happiness, health, and spirituality, this idea of an accelerating world, it's a fallacy. It only exists in other people's minds. So, that's it.
Thank you, Brian. So I want to make 2 points, and I invite comments on it. So one was the point that Joe was making, is the power of principles. That's a very powerful point, because it's a way of kind of saying, okay, what really matters, and trying to capture it, you know, in as brief a way as possible. So no matter what else is changing, you're trying to kind of say, what is the center of gravity? You know, what really matters in what you should be doing. It's mostly principles are kind of are ways of acting. It is patterns of acting. It is the how. And then they're connected with values that you're seeking. So the values and virtues, those kind of remain, they're much more stable than the particular things that are going on around you. So that's one point. The second point I want to make is that of proactive versus reactive. And that's a huge point. I think that, I mean, this is again, looking at kind of Julian Jaynes and different technologies. We're living through this electric age, okay, where things like TV, advertising, all of that, there's this entire large-scale media that you are bombarded with. This includes kind of social networks. I would summarize it as TV, the TV media. It is driving people to be reactive for things like Jade was talking about. Okay, you need to get people to buy the next car, or you need to get them to buy this or that. So it's a financial level. It's also kind of attention level. You know, people want to capture your attention, and they will do or say anything to make you typically angry or kind of upset in order to get you to do something. So a lot of the media is like that. So that's kind of TV-based media, which counts on you being reactive, and avoiding that, deducting that from your life is tremendously powerful, tremendously powerful. So, you know, the reason I like writing, for example, is writing is proactive. Even listening is reactive. So if you're writing, and for the purpose of writing your thoughts, you are listening to things, then it's good, because it's the proactive action which is shaping your reactive action. But if you're just kind of going through life like watching TV, if you're engaging in mostly spectator sport as far as life goes, that's reactive. And there, basically, you are letting change happen to you. when you are moving, when you are doing things, when you are writing, when you're speaking, you are moving things, you are moving yourself. So I think it's a much more powerful, much more adaptive way of being. So those are my thoughts about kind of proactive versus reactive. So any thoughts, any comments on proactive versus reactive? Madeline.
Yes, I was thinking actually more about the first part of what you said, principles.
You can address any of those points. Go ahead.
Okay, and proactive versus reactive in the age of media, whether it's the previous one, the TV era and radio broadcast, or whether it's participatory like digital, is that the number of people who live in my head has grown hugely. From the era of TV and radio that I started out my life in, with, there was limited exposure, there were people around me. Now, when I go through the news on my phone, I've got all these senators in my head, I've got presidents, I've got people weighing in with their opinions. It's been a while since I've been on social media outlets, but I had various artists who I was following and their artwork. And so it's, in a way, it's like population growth has kind of taken over inside of me as well. And the discussion committee has gotten much larger. And it was kind of easier when the committee in my head had fewer members. And it's kind of, on the other hand, I don't know.
Okay. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Jyoti. Jyoti, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to address about what you said about writing. I think writing is a great tool, a therapeutic tool for healing. When I was grieving, I was writing every day in my journal. Like I said before, I didn't find an appropriate support group or therapist to go to. So I was writing and I was extending myself to other people. And I felt like there was something every day that I wrote that had helped me to move on, to move forward. So I think writing is definitely, a great tool for recalling, for remembering, for moving on, for organizing your thoughts. And it's definitely, and like I said, I'm still looking for my cookie because I started to write the notes before you even asked us to write the notes. So I know the writing has a beneficial power on us. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you, Jyoti. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Jade. Joe.
Can you repeat the second part of the question really quickly? The embracing.
Yeah. So it's the distinction between proactive and reactive.
And I think, yeah, they did the one thing that impacts that is the idea of speed by which things change. Your ability to be proactive and how fast things are changing, and especially in a digital age, is something that's going to be very problematic, I think, going forward, as far as when you look at workforces and what will essentially happen to people's ability to adapt and be proactive, because things will be changing so quickly that they won't be able to be proactive. At least subsets of people. And that's the only thing I really wanted to add to that, is the impact of the rate of change and how that impacts your ability to react. So,
thank you, Joe. Next up is Jade. Jade, go ahead.
I think there are probably tons of things that make the difference, but I would say the biggest difference is honesty. And I mean, like, for the coming generations, I feel like a lot of the reasons why change is so difficult is, again, because we're rebranding the same old problems and trying to come up with solutions because we don't really recognize that the previous generations had them. And I know a lot of time, I can only speak for what I've experienced with my peers. They don't really do a lot of intergenerational communication. There isn't a lot of people are figuring out things from scratch, as though existence started with us and it didn't. And I think that makes things hard because it just makes things harder, because people are hiding the playbooks. Sometimes it's because of shame. Sometimes it's because we've made certain things taboo, even if they're not shameful. It's just something that you don't speak about in public. But it's like there's so many things that are commonplace, that, again, people could navigate better if they understood all the various approaches to it, because it's you need a toolbox. And if you aren't equipped with the proper tools, you're gonna have a hard time figuring out what, or if you don't even understand the interface, how can you interface with the interface you don't understand? So it's a question of people not being blindsided by a cyclical life. There are things that happen. And yeah, I guess I'm gonna leave it there, which is a weird place, but that's the thought I want to put out there. And oh, one more thing. I know that people are, I think, on some level trying to remedy this with like opening up on social media, but like that's another place where, as I put it in another thing, the oregano gets left out, where you're giving someone the recipe, but you're not really giving them all the pieces, and you can't. So I feel like that's something that has to happen on a personal level, on a person-to-person connection level, because a lot of things have to be customized. We're worried about customized cars and sneakers, like Converse. I love Converse. I could get I could go online and make a customized Converse. But what people really need are people who understand them, who can give them customized approaches and things like that. So that's kind of where I am. So it's a difficult thing to say. How proactive you could be about something you weren't expecting, you didn't know existed.
Thank you, Jade. So, folks, this has been an amazing amazing conversation. And I think this format works very well. And I think the writing is adding to the depth of the conversation. I particularly liked Jennifer. It was very clear that Jennifer had written these things down and she was reading it out, because it was like, just very crisp and clear stuff. But in whatever form we do it, because writing, it really turbocharges your mind. I mean, it is the idea of externalizing your thinking. So it's like expanding your mind, if you will. What you're doing is that you're expanding your memory. You're taking something that is just there inside, where your capacity of reflecting on it is limited, and you're putting it out there, and then you're able to look at it as if it was outside, because it is outside, from many, many different angles. And you can put other things right next to it, and you can see all the connections, and you can rise above that. You can see, oh, there is this pattern that I see. You could never do that just by doing it in the head. So we're going to be exploring this theme of various media. I'm also looking at this media that we are engaging in right now, of this Zoom, okay? And the specific way in which we are doing it, because, I'm kind of crafting this continuously in terms of how do you design this, to design these meetups for maximum learning for everybody, for me and for each of you. So the idea of having presentations, having PowerPoints, having notebooks where everybody is keeping track of their thoughts and kind of coming back, I think all of that is working really well. So look forward to expanding that further. We have some incredible meetups coming up. I particularly recommend the series that we are doing on Saturday and Sunday at 12 o'clock. And that is Julian Jaynes, and looking at how technology is changing our life today. Julian Jaynes on Saturdays, and the technology and how the life is changing on Sundays, both at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you very much, folks. Good night.